Your girlfriend just told you she can't hang out tonight because of the full moon. Your coworker has more crystals on her desk than office supplies. Your sister knows exactly what Mercury retrograde means, and she's adjusting her life around it. Coincidence? I don't think so. The historical roots of which stereotypes are deeply intertwined with centuries of systematic oppression, fear, and the persecution of women who dared to exist outside societal norms. When we talk about witches today, we're invoking an identity that carries the weight of immense historical trauma, misogyny, and violence that targeted predominantly women, though men were also accused and executed. Understanding this context is crucial because it reveals that the witch hunts were never really about magic or supernatural powers. They were about control, power, and the suppression of female autonomy. During the medieval period, and particularly through the early modern era spanning roughly from the 15th to 18th centuries, Europe and colonial America experienced waves of witch hysteria that resulted in the torture and execution of tens of thousands of people. The Salem witch trials of 1692 in Massachusetts are perhaps the most famous example in American consciousness, where 20 people were executed and hundreds more accused based on spectral evidence and mass paranoia. But Salem was merely a footnote compared to the European witch hunts, where estimates suggest between 40,000 to 60,000 people were killed, though some historians believe the numbers could be even higher when accounting for unrecorded deaths and those who died during torture or imprisonment. The profile of the accused reveals the true nature of these persecutions. Women made up approximately 75 to 80% of those accused, and they often shared common characteristics that made them vulnerable or threatening to patriarchal power structures. Widows who owned property, elderly women without male protection, midwives and healers who possessed medical knowledge that rivaled or surpassed that of male physicians, women who were outspoken or quarrelsome, and those who simply didn't conform to expectations of female behavior were all prime targets. The witch became a convenient scapegoat for everything from failed crops to infant mortality, from impotence to economic hardship. Many accused witches were actually skilled herbalists and healers who understood plants, remedies, and women's reproductive health. In an era when medical knowledge was limited and often monopolized by educated men who had access to universities from which women were excluded, these female healers provided essential community services. They attended births, treated illnesses, created pain remedies, and possessed knowledge passed down through generations of women. This expertise, however, made them threatening to both religious authorities and the emerging male-dominated medical profession. The famous medieval text Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, explicitly connected midwifery with witchcraft, claiming that no one did more harm to the Catholic faith than midwives. The stereotypical image of the witch that persists today, the haggard old woman with a pointed hat, warts, a black cat, and a broomstick, was deliberately constructed through propaganda, art, and literature designed to make these women seem grotesque, dangerous, and other. These visual markers served to dehumanize the accused and justify their persecution. The pointed hat may have originated from the Jewish yellow badge Jews were forced to wear, transferred onto another marginalized group. The broomstick connection likely came from folk practices or from confessions extracted under torture. The black cat became associated with familiars or demonic spirits that supposedly aided witches, though in reality many accused women were simply lonely elderly women whose only companions were their pets. Religious reformation, social upheaval, economic anxiety, and the desire to consolidate power all contributed to the witch hunt phenomenon. When communities faced unexplainable tragedies or tensions, accusing someone of witchcraft provided both an explanation and a release valve for collective anxiety. The legal proceedings themselves were nightmarish, often involving torture designed to extract confessions, trials where the accused could not win regardless of their defense, and spectacles of execution meant to terrify communities into conformity. This dark chapter represents one of history's most systematic campaigns of gender-based violence, disguised as religious duty and legal justice, but functioning as a mechanism to control women's bodies, knowledge, sexuality, and independence. The modern reclamation of the witch identity represents one of the most fascinating cultural shifts of the past several decades, transforming a term once used to condemn and execute women into a powerful symbol of feminine strength, spiritual autonomy, and resistance against patriarchal systems. This reclamation didn't happen overnight, but emerged through various cultural movements, particularly gaining momentum during the feminist waves of the 1960s and 70s, and experiencing a significant resurgence in recent years through social media, pop culture, and a broader cultural appetite for alternative spirituality. Contemporary women who identify as witches are consciously taking back a word that was weaponized against their ancestors, refusing to let that history of oppression define its meaning any longer. This act of reclamation is deeply political and personal simultaneously. By embracing the witch identity, modern practitioners are essentially saying that the very qualities that once made women targets, independence, knowledge of healing, spiritual connection, sexual autonomy, and refusal to submit to male authority, are actually sources of power worth celebrating. The witch becomes a symbol of the woman who refuses to be tamed, controlled, or diminished by societal expectations. Modern witchcraft encompasses an incredibly diverse range of practices and belief systems, reflecting the deeply personal nature of spiritual exploration. Wicca, founded in the mid-20th century by Gerald Gardner and further developed by practitioners like Doreen Valiente, provides a structured religious framework complete with deities, ritual practices, and moral codes like the Wiccan Rede, which states, "An it harm none, do what ye will." Wiccan practitioners often worship both a goddess and god, celebrate 8 seasonal Sabbats marking the wheel of the year, and work with the elements in ceremonial contexts. However, Wicca represents just one path among many. Eclectic witchcraft has become increasingly popular, particularly among younger practitioners who build their own personalized spiritual practices by drawing from various traditions, cultural practices, and intuitive guidance. These practitioners might work with tarot cards for divination and self-reflection, use crystals for energy work and intention setting, practice herbalism for both physical healing and magical purposes, follow lunar cycles to time their rituals and manifestation work, and create their own spells and ceremonies that resonate with their individual needs and beliefs. The beauty of eclectic practice lies in its flexibility and personal authenticity rather than adherence to any prescribed tradition. Paganism provides another umbrella under which many modern witches gather, encompassing earth-based spiritual practices that honor nature, recognize divinity in the natural world, and often draw inspiration from pre-Christian European traditions. Some practitioners focus specifically on Norse, Celtic, Greek, or other cultural pantheons and practices, while others create syncretic approaches that blend multiple influences. Kitchen witchcraft centers magical practice around cooking and hearth activities, transforming everyday tasks into sacred acts. Green witchcraft emphasizes connection with plants, gardening, and herbal magic. Hedge witchcraft focuses on shamanic journeying and working between worlds. The diversity is extraordinary and continually evolving. Feminism and witchcraft have become increasingly intertwined, with many viewing witchcraft as a form of feminist praxis. The witch represents the unruly woman who won't be silenced, the healer who trusts her own wisdom over institutional authority, and the spiritual seeker who creates her own relationship with the divine rather than accepting male-dominated religious hierarchies. Groups like WITCH, the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, formed during the late 1960s, explicitly used witch imagery in political protests, hexing patriarchal institutions, and performing guerrilla theater that challenged sexism and capitalism. Social media has amplified this movement exponentially, with platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube creating global communities where practitioners share knowledge, rituals, experiences, and support. Hashtags like Witches of Instagram and Witch Talk have millions of posts demonstrating the massive contemporary interest in these practices. This digital connectivity has democratized access to information that was once hidden in obscure texts or passed down through initiatory traditions, though it has also sparked debates about cultural appropriation, commercialization, and the authenticity of rapidly spreading practices. Popular culture has created and perpetuated a visual and behavioral lexicon of witchcraft that bears almost no resemblance to actual modern witchcraft practices, yet these stereotypes remain deeply embedded in collective consciousness. The image most people conjure when hearing the word witch comes not from historical reality or contemporary practice, but from centuries of artistic depictions, children's stories, Hollywood films, and commercial Halloween imagery that have distilled witchcraft into a collection of easily recognizable but fundamentally inaccurate symbols. The pointy black hat, the bubbling cauldron, the warty nose, the cackling laugh, the broomstick flight, and the black cat familiar have become so synonymous with witches that distinguishing between fiction and reality becomes genuinely challenging for those unfamiliar with actual practice. These stereotypes serve multiple functions in society, most of them problematic. They trivialize what is for many a sincere spiritual practice and religious identity. They make witchcraft seem cartoonish and therefore dismissible, which allows mainstream culture to avoid taking seriously the historical persecution of accused witches or the legitimate spiritual needs that contemporary practitioners are addressing through their work. The commercialization of witch imagery, particularly around Halloween, reduces complex spiritual traditions to costume accessories and party decorations, stripping away meaning and context. When a person's religious or spiritual identity becomes a punchline or a purchasable aesthetic, it creates real harm by suggesting that identity isn't worthy of respect or understanding. The media representation of witches has evolved somewhat over time, but continues to rely heavily on established tropes. Classic films like The Wizard of Oz gave us the green-skinned Wicked Witch of the West, cementing the association between witchcraft and evil ugliness in contrast to the good, beautiful Glinda. The television show Bewitched in the 1960s presented a more benign vision, but still portrayed witchcraft as something that involved literal supernatural powers, like nose-twitching telekinesis, rather than spiritual practice. More recent representations in shows like Charmed, The Craft, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and American Horror Story, Coven have offered varying depictions, sometimes acknowledging real witchcraft elements like herbs and rituals, but invariably adding Hollywood's requirement for dramatic supernatural powers that real practitioners don't claim to possess in such literal forms. What actual modern witchcraft involves is far more grounded and accessible than popular culture suggests. Herbalism forms a significant component of many practices, where practitioners study the medicinal and magical properties of plants, create tinctures and teas, grow their own herbs, and use botanical knowledge for healing and ritual purposes. This isn't about magical potions that literally transform people, but about understanding how chamomile promotes relaxation, how lavender aids sleep, how mugwort enhances dream work, and how various plants can be incorporated into spiritual practices with intention and respect. Tarot reading serves as a tool for introspection, psychological exploration, and accessing intuition rather than fortune telling in the mystical sense media portrays. The cards act as mirrors reflecting the reader's subconscious knowledge and providing frameworks for thinking through complex situations. Crystal work involves selecting stones based on their purported energetic properties and using them as focal points for meditation, intention setting, and mindfulness practices. Whether crystals possess literal metaphysical properties remains debated, but their use as tangible reminders of one's goals and as beautiful natural objects that facilitate contemplative states is undeniable. Moon rituals align personal practice with lunar cycles, recognizing that humans have always been affected by natural rhythms and that deliberately syncing spiritual work with these cycles can create meaningful structure. New moons might be times for setting intentions and beginning projects, while full moons become moments for release, gratitude, and manifestation work. Intention setting lies at the heart of most contemporary witchcraft, emphasizing that directing conscious attention and will toward desired outcomes creates psychological and sometimes material change. This isn't supernatural in the Hollywood sense, but rather an acknowledgement of how human consciousness, belief, and focused action shape reality. Meditation, journaling, candle magic, where specific colored candles represent different intentions, creating altars as sacred spaces, and celebrating seasonal changes all form part of diverse modern practices that look nothing like the stereotypical witch imagery, but represent genuine, meaningful spiritual engagement for millions of practitioners worldwide. The tension between playful, entertaining content about witchcraft and the responsibility to avoid trivializing or perpetuating harmful narratives creates a complex ethical landscape that content creators and audiences must navigate thoughtfully. On one hand, humor, lightheartedness, and accessible content about witch signs can serve as entry points for people to learn about modern witchcraft, challenge stereotypes, and recognize that practitioners are ordinary people with diverse interests and backgrounds. These playful approaches can demystify witchcraft, make it less intimidating, and create community through shared jokes and relatable observations. On the other hand, there exists a genuine risk of reducing rich spiritual traditions to mere aesthetics, ignoring the brutal historical reality of witch persecution and inadvertently reinforcing the very stereotypes that have harmed women for centuries. The historical violence against accused witches cannot be overstated or forgotten in our contemporary engagement with witch identity and imagery. Conservative estimates suggest that between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed during the European witch hunts, spanning roughly from 1450 to 1750. Though some historians argue the actual numbers could be significantly higher when accounting for those who died during imprisonment, from torture, or in regions where records were poorly maintained or have been lost to time. These weren't quick or merciful deaths. Accused witches were subjected to horrific torture designed to extract confessions, including strappado, where victims' arms were tied behind their backs and they were suspended by ropes causing shoulder dislocation, thumb screws that crushed fingers, the rack that pulled bodies apart, and water torture that simulated drowning. Swimming tests involved binding accused witches and throwing them into water, with the logic that if they floated they were guilty and if they sank they were innocent, meaning survival proved guilt and drowning proved innocence posthumously. The cruel absurdity of these tests reveals they were never about discovering truth, but about providing legal cover for murder. Women were burned alive at stakes, hanged in public spectacles meant to terrify communities into conformity, crushed under heavy stones in a form of execution called pressing, and subjected to other brutal forms of execution that varied by region and legal tradition. The psychological torture extended beyond the accused to their families and communities. As children watched their mothers executed, neighbors were forced to testify against each other under threat, and entire communities lived in paranoid fear of accusation. The trauma rippled through generations, teaching women that certain knowledge, behaviors, or expressions of autonomy could result in death. This wasn't ancient history occurring in some distant primitive past, but continued well into the 18th century in supposedly enlightened Europe, and occurred in colonial America, where the founding principles of religious freedom were being established, even as witch trials proceeded. The victims weren't random, but followed disturbing patterns that reveal the gendered nature of this violence. Elderly women, particularly widows who owned property that would revert to male relatives or the community upon their deaths, were disproportionately targeted. Women who were healers, midwives, or possessed medical knowledge threatened the emerging male-dominated medical profession and were frequently accused. Women who were argumentative, refused to defer to male authority, were sexually independent, or simply didn't conform to narrow definitions of acceptable feminine behavior became targets. Poor women who relied on community charity could be accused when that charity became burdensome, while women who were too wealthy and independent threatened patriarchal economic structures. Essentially, any woman could become vulnerable to accusation if she possessed qualities, knowledge, or resources that threatened existing power structures, or if she provided a convenient scapegoat for community misfortunes. Understanding this history transforms how we should engage with witch content and imagery. Playful videos about signs she's a witch can be harmless fun when they celebrate qualities like independence, knowledge of herbs, interest in tarot, or connection with nature as positive attributes worth claiming proudly. This type of content participates in the Reclamation project, taking back the witch identity and redefining it on practitioners' terms rather than persecutors' terms. However, content that perpetuates ideas about witches being evil, dangerous, manipulative, or other becomes problematic because it echoes the propaganda that justified real violence. Even seemingly innocent jokes about witches cursing people or causing harm can reinforce narratives that made persecution possible by portraying female power as inherently threatening or malicious. The line between playful and harmful often comes down to whether content punches up or punches down, whether it empowers or diminishes, whether it educates or merely entertains while perpetuating ignorance. Content that acknowledges the historical context, respects contemporary practitioners' actual beliefs and practices, and uses humor to challenge rather than reinforce stereotypes serves the reclamation project. Content that treats witchcraft as merely a trendy aesthetic, divorced from any real meaning or history, that makes light of persecution, or that perpetuates the idea that women with power or knowledge are threatening, fails this ethical test. The challenge for creators becomes balancing accessibility and entertainment value with responsibility and respect for both historical victims and contemporary practitioners. Education must accompany entertainment when dealing with topics carrying this much historical weight and contemporary significance. Audiences deserve to know that when they laugh at which jokes or engage with which content, they're participating in a conversation with centuries of context. The women burned, hanged, and tortured deserve to be remembered not as statistics or distant historical abstractions, but as real people whose deaths were unjust, whose knowledge was valuable, and whose persecution should never be forgotten or repeated. Modern practitioners who identify as witches carry this history with them, and their reclamation of the identity represents a refusal to let that violence have the final word on what a witch means or who gets to define female power and autonomy.